When you think of WrestleMania, you think of Hulk Hogan body slamming Andre the Giant. When you think of Survivor Series, you automatically think of the Montreal Screwjob and the debut of The Undertaker. But what about SummerSlam? There's a reason this event is one of the pillar events in WWE's history. So on this episode of the Pipe Bomb Wrestling Podcast, we're going to dive deep into the moments and memories that have made SummerSlam the must-see show of the summer. It's time to kick it old school here on the Pipe Bomb Wrestling Podcast. The bomb drops now. Hello and welcome to this old school Monday edition of the Pipe Bomb Wrestling Podcast, the show that is for the fans, by the fans. I am your phenomenal host, Mr. Podcasting, Chris Belcher. You can follow me on social media at Chris Belcher24. The show is at PBW Podcast, and we are on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Make sure you give us a follow, like, share, comment, all those things. We love fan interaction. If you are listening on SportsWire, formerly known as Sportinarium Radio, now known as SportsWire. Thank you so much for checking us out. You can still listen to all their great shows over at sportinarium.com. They are in the middle of revamping a little bit. There'll be more details coming out on that. But if you're listening there, thank you so much for doing that. Once again, my name's Chris Belcher. I'm your host and my tag team partner today. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you bought your tickets to the gun show, because there it is. Mr. Old School himself, Jared Justice. No, I'm not talking about Hulk Hogan. Although if you put on that Hulk Hogan bandana right there, that would suit you pretty well. Mr. Jared Justice is back after a couple episode absence. What's going on, man? How are you?
Buddy, just hanging in there like a hair in a biscuit, buddy. How you doing?
Oh my gosh, we're so Eastern Kentucky. It's not even funny. Oh my gosh, but man, SummerSlam, it is the must-see show of the summer. We are in full-blown SummerSlam mode. We are less than 2 weeks away from the biggest party of the summer, and I know we don't talk about current stuff on this edition of the show. On Mondays, we don't necessarily talk about current stuff, but man, I think it's a good a time as any to let the cat out of the bag that you're not only there working on the gun show, you are getting yourself geared up for Vegas, because you and I are taking a last minute trip to Las Vegas to SummerSlam. How about that?
Yes, sir. And Nick Gage, I got the hair shaved. I got the beard growing. I'm going to have a bandana around the head. Yeah, I'm going to be meeting him. How about that? Oh my
gosh. So there's some cool stuff going on for Las Vegas. We're going to try to hit up as much stuff as we can. We are going to SummerSlam. So hopefully your post SummerSlam show that you will be listening to from us will be live from Vegas, as long as the world doesn't shut down again in the next 2 weeks, or we get a ban on mass gatherings or whatever. Try not to think about that, but we are less than 2 weeks away, man. SummerSlam, it's going to be awesome. But we will dive into current stuff over the next week or so as we preview and we review SummerSlam. But let's jump back old school, man. SummerSlam, me and you, we talked about on this podcast a lot. You and I grew up watching WrestleManias and Royal Rumbles and SummerSlams. Maybe not necessarily so much Survivor Series, but definitely SummerSlam, Rumble, and Mania. We watched those, as much as humanly possible. If we picked out some events that we watched, it's definitely those that we watched the most. So obviously you and I look back on SummerSlam very fondly. So that's what this podcast is about. We're going to look back because, as I said in the intro, man, when you talk about WrestleMania, you think Hogan Andre, you think Hogan Warrior, you think Austin Rock, you think all of those kind of things. Survivor Series, The Undertaker, the debut of The Rock, Shawn and Bret. Royal Rumble, you think of Hogan winning, you think recently of Drew McIntyre winning. Just all kinds of great highlights from all those events. But SummerSlam, the question we're going to pose on this podcast is, when you say SummerSlam, what do you think of? And this was an idea that you posed to me. It's like, everything there's always one big thing that sticks out to you when you say something in wrestling. You know what I mean? If you throw up the four fingers, I mean, obviously you think of Ric Flair, you think of Arn Anderson, you think of NWA. There's trigger words in the world of wrestling. Am I right? Or am I just babbling here?
Oh yeah, you're correct. I mean, you see this, you think Horseman instantly.
Right. Exactly.
Too Sweet, NWO.
Exactly.
DX.
Right where? Down where? Right there. So there are trigger words in the wrestling business that trigger certain feelings. So I'm going to throw it to you right offhand. So this is going to be, if you're listening and you're used to us going down bullet point by bullet point and covering things, this is not going to be that. Jared and I are basically, it's like we're hitting record on a phone conversation that you and I would have.
Right.
And these are the best kind of podcasts. So this is going to be a very free form discussion. We have no agenda on exactly where to go on this. So I'm just going to pose a question to you right off, man. When you say SummerSlam, or when you hear me say SummerSlam, what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
Shawn and Razor in the second ladder match.
Really? That's the first.
I think that's the first thing, man. Yep.
Really? Why so?
Yep. I don't know, man. I think back whenever that they did it for the first time at WrestleMania 10, and we hadn't really ever seen a ladder match in the WWF except for, like, I think it was the Most Unusual Matches VHS release that had Bret and Shawn. We hadn't really ever seen a ladder match until WrestleMania 10. And oh my God, the roof blew off the place and they went banana. And so then you getting another one. You're getting the rematch.
Yeah.
And so I don't know, man. And I think that was maybe around that was whenever me and you were hanging out a lot. Yep. During summer, we're off from school. And I just remember us watching this match and like having our figures and making the ladder matches and talking about how me and you could have a ladder match and just crazy stuff. So yeah, I think that's why.
It's funny that you mentioned that ladder match, because a lot of people will say, yeah, that match was great if it hadn't been the second one, if it hadn't have been the sequel to the WrestleMania 10. So do you prefer that SummerSlam match over WrestleMania 10 if you're comparing, or is that just the most vivid SummerSlam memory for you?
I think it's just the most vivid SummerSlam memory. Okay. I don't know which one I like better, honestly. But for some reason, that one sticks out more in my memory. Gotcha. So,
gotcha. Oh, I love that match. I love that, like, visually in my head, one of the things that I can picture is, I remember, I can picture it vividly. Shawn Michaels climbing up the ladder in the aisleway, pointing at Razor, doing his thing. It's the only time I remember him wearing that gear, the silver chaps and vest with the blue and all that kind of stuff. But, I, like you, thought that was one of the greatest things ever until SummerSlam 2002 comes along. Because when I hear SummerSlam, my immediate thought goes to my favorite SummerSlam match and moment of all time, and that is the return of Shawn Michaels after a 4-year hiatus in the street fight against the Game Triple H. We have talked about that match ad nauseum on our previous season of this podcast, and maybe we'll dive into it a little more later this season. But that match is Shawn going into that match, not wrestled for 4 years, didn't do any kind of rehearsal, refused to do any kind of rehearsal, refused to go in and take bumps, basically just told Hunter, hey man, we'll call it out there. It's just going to have to be there. And they went for 45 minutes. And it was just unbelievable. So that's my first thought when I think of SummerSlam.
Yeah. And I mean, there's so many SummerSlams that we saw, like we were talking about, the match made in heaven and the match made in hell. Yeah. I remember us watching that over and over and over. You had a Warrior in there against Rude in the steel cage.
Yep. That one's one of my favorites too.
And if you remember, I actually couldn't find that. I think I've told this story on here before. And there was a boy up the road that had bought it on pay-per-view and had recorded it on VHS. And I bought it from him. And then me and you watched it.
Yeah.
Because back then you couldn't just turn on the network, or you couldn't even always go to the local video store and rent it, anything you wanted. So,
Yeah, Warrior and Rude, that's probably one of my favorites, honestly, because I was a huge Warrior fan, especially growing up. So him winning the title from Hogan at WrestleMania, that was a VHS I rented and played to death. And then SummerSlam 1990 was right behind it because that was really the only other big title defense that he had until he lost the belt to Slaughter at Rumble. Yep. So getting to see him as world champion. In fact, I've got that Ultimate Warrior figure sitting down here on my shelf from that event because that event is so special in my mind. So Shawn Michaels would be number one, that match with Triple H. And then number two, a close second, is that Ultimate Warrior match against Rick Rude. I think that's a great one. You mentioned the match made in heaven and the match made in hell. That was 91. Is that correct?
I think so.
That's when Savage and Liz got married, right?
Correct.
Okay, so that would have been 91 because that was the SummerSlam after WrestleMania 7 when they got back together. So that 1991 SummerSlam produced a match and a moment that a lot of people regard as the greatest SummerSlam match of all time. Definitely underrated, but could be the greatest of all time. I'm talking about the one you and I, again, have watched to death. Bret Hart and Mr. Perfect for the Intercontinental Championship, where Perfect gets the singlet ripped off. Bret does the fantastic counter into the sharpshooter. Man, if you guys are listening to this podcast and you have not watched that match, go out of your way. SummerSlam 91. Jared, I can't put that match over enough.
Yeah, I mean, it's a perfect match in a lot of ways. I mean, if you think of the perfect match, the perfect counters, the perfect ending, it has Mr. Perfect in it. So I mean, that's a match that you'll never be able to replicate or duplicate. It just turned out great. I mean,
it really did.
There's no flaws.
And what a lot of people might not realize is Mr. Perfect was at the end of his prime at that point. He had a really bad back injury that took him out of action. Really, he would never get back into full-fledged, full-time in-ring competition after this match because of his back injury. So to see not only the performance that he put on in this match, but the way that Bret carried him to a great performance despite a back injury, it's just kudos to both of those guys for an incredible effort. When we talk about Bret Hart, speaking of shows that we did last season on this podcast, we did a whole show devoted to how the Hart family is synonymous with SummerSlam, specifically Bret the Hitman Hart. 1990, we mentioned that show earlier, a fantastic 2 out of 3 falls match that Bret and Jim the Anvil Neidhart had against Demolition, one of my favorite tag matches of all time. Then you've got, of course, the infamous Wembley Stadium 1992 main event. Bret drops the Intercontinental title to the British Bulldog. You've got 1994. Bret defends the WWF title in a steel cage against his brother Owen. And then 97 is another one that sticks out. Bret Hart's last WWF title win against The Undertaker. Man, if Hulk Hogan is WrestleMania, Bret Hart's SummerSlam, man. I mean,
oh yeah.
I don't know anybody else to put on that pedestal but Bret Hart.
Yep. I mean, almost every match you think of in some way has Bret Hart in it.
Then he had a couple stinkers in there that I didn't mention. The match against Isaac Yankem. I think he wrestled. I don't remember who he wrestled in 93. But he wrestled somebody in 93. And then they wrestled, Hart Foundation wrestled Demolition at the first SummerSlam when they were heels. So Bret Hart, man, all over SummerSlam. And I don't know if that's just
against his brother Owen in the cage.
Yeah, in 94, one of the best cage matches of all time. Yep. You know, those two guys went at it and had a fantastic match. It was the culmination of their feud because, of course, they wrestled at the SummerSlam or the WrestleMania right before that. So if Bret Hart is SummerSlam, you have to think that a guy like, when we mentioned Hogan, let's talk about Hogan for a minute. Hogan in his career at SummerSlam had some also memorable matches. One that sticks out is against a guy that we just mentioned a little bit ago, Shawn Michaels, 2005. Of course, that wasn't in the prime of Hogan's career, but it was a dream match. It was one of those matches where really, and correct me if I'm wrong and add to this, obviously, one of the first dream matches that we looked at as wrestling fans, as far as people being in the same promotion and just not at the same time. And like, man, what I would have given for that match to have actually happened. And then it did. You know, is there any others that you can think of, or just comment on that match specifically?
I just love it because that Shawn was, if you believe the rumor and innuendo, Shawn was kind of pissed that Hogan was insisting that Hogan go over. And so he bounced all around that ring. I mean, just a ridiculous amount. I mean, Hogan would nail him and Shawn would go flying. And I mean, like, you could tell that Shawn was basically just kind of flipping him the bird and saying, okay, you want this to be so ridiculous that people think that you in your old state can beat me, the showstopper, then I'm going to make this just so over the top ridiculous that it's not really even going to be your typical match. Right. So here we go. And I just love it. It's hilarious to watch.
Shawn, well, I mean, Shawn's confirmed this. They told him in the storyline, Shawn wanted to be a face versus face match. Shawn wanted to approach it from, hey, Hulk, I just got to know, man, you know, if we were to collide, who would win? Respect, you know, yada, yada, yada. And then Hulk comes back with, no, I want you to be a heel kind of thing. It
doesn't work for me, brother.
It doesn't work for me, brother. That's right. Hulk is of the mindset of, no, I want you to be a heel. And then Creative comes to Shawn and says, we want 1997, 98 Shawn. And Shawn says, really? That's what you want? So the infamous Larry King spoof with Shawn dressing up like Hogan, I'll never forget. One of my all-time favorite Shawn promos. And then, like you said, he gets in the ring and he bounces around, basically giving the middle finger to Hulk Hogan, just like he would have done if he had to wrestle him in 97 or 98.
Yep.
Instead, it was a different Shawn, because in 97, 98, Shawn would have been that doesn't work for me, brother. I'm not doing it. But in 2005, he had, of course, turned his life around and was willing to do business, but not without being defiant and sticking up that middle finger, so to speak, to Hogan.
Yep, I loved it. It was great.
I think it's fantastic. So we talked about Hogan. Obviously, he was involved the night we've mentioned SummerSlam 91 several times. Sounds like something that a lot of our listeners should go back and watch if they haven't, in a long time at least, because you've got Savage and Liz and their wedding. Jake the Snake brings the Cobra out at the end. You've got Bret and Perfect. You've also got Hogan teaming up with the Ultimate Warrior against Sergeant Slaughter, General Adnan, and Colonel Mustafa. This is the night that was detailed very vividly, and just a lot of new information came to light with the most recent Dark Side of the Ring season and the A&E biographies. Both of them talk about the Ultimate Warrior holding up Vince McMahon the night of SummerSlam 91. So to me, just as much as Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, and Hulk Hogan are synonymous with SummerSlam, we mentioned Warrior in 1990. 91, he holds up Vince McMahon. What's more infamous than holding up the boss? And then when you come back through the curtain, he basically gives you your pink slip.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's a great story. So, you know, you had Warrior and you had Vince, who were almost two of a kind, two of the same, two birds of the same feather almost.
Yeah.
They're both charismatic. They both have very high opinions of themselves. They both wanted things the way they wanted things. The difference was Vince owned the company. Warrior did not. So you can't just hold up the boss and then not expect anything to happen in return. So that's kind of how it went.
Well, I think it's interesting because the Dark Side of the Ring and the A&E biography, they both detailed. Warrior wrote Vince a long letter of all of his demands that he wanted. He wanted Hogan money. He wanted Hogan attention. He wanted Hogan notoriety, yada, yada, yada. And basically, Vince said, screw you. You're not nearly the draw or the athlete or the whatever that Hulk Hogan is. I just think it's hilarious that this is 1991. Not even less than 2 years later, Vince would write off Hulk Hogan almost as easily as he did the Ultimate Warrior. Of course, he didn't have a lot of choice with the steroid stuff going on. maybe that was just a perfect storm, but I just find it interesting that basically the same thing happened with Hulk Hogan, you know?
Yeah, and I mean, right around this time, I think it was 90, was WrestleMania 6, wasn't it? Whenever that you had Warrior go over Hogan.
Yep.
And so if he's not as big of a draw, then why did you put him over? I mean, none of this makes sense. Right. I mean, whenever I think of this time frame, I think of Hogan and Warrior. I think Warrior probably should have been getting Hogan money, but whatever, you know.
I definitely think he should have been getting Hogan money. I mean, for sure, because look at the Ultimate Warrior. I think it was you and I. Yeah, it was you and I that had an offline discussion about this, talking about the Ultimate Warrior. No, maybe it was me and my dad. We have a lot of the same conversations, so I sort of get confused sometimes. But around this time, this same time frame, was when contract negotiations started heating up with Sting and the WWE. And Sting almost came to WWE. He has gone on record and said this time period was the closest he ever came to jumping ship. And he didn't do it for whatever reason. And I told my dad, I said, look, because he was talking about how bad Warrior was and whatever. And I said, look, Warrior was a draw. But could you imagine if you basically take Warrior out of the equation and you insert 1990, 1991 Sting? Because not only do you still have the face paint, you still have the charisma, you still have being a fan favorite, but now you have a better promo. Now you have a better wrestler. Now you have a better businessman. Just put your creative hat on there for a second. Take Warrior out. Sting Hogan instead of Starrcade 97, WrestleMania 6. I mean, come on.
Well, I mean, I would have went the route of having Sting come in against Warrior and bringing in, you know, like what was their name? The
Blade Runners.
Blade Runners. Have them go against each other, have Sting beat Warrior, Warrior fades away, then you do Sting against Hogan because you built Sting with the WWF crowd because he just beat Warrior. So that's the route I would go.
But yeah, absolutely. Oh, I get that for sure. But in that perspective, like, that just puts in perspective that even though Sting could have replaced Warrior and he would have been huge, that doesn't take away from the fact that Warrior was huge at that point.
Oh, yeah.
You know, 91, he was huge. Everybody was clamoring for him. 90, you mentioned that he went over Hogan, and we already mentioned the match against Rude. Go back 2 years earlier at SummerSlam in 88. Honky Tonk Man was the longest reigning Intercontinental Champion of all time, 460 plus days. Who ended his title reign in like 8 seconds? The Ultimate Warrior. Ultimate Warrior did. So that's to your point that this is so convoluted and it's so like Hogan was the guy. No, wait, Warrior's the guy. Now Warrior's not the guy and he can never be Hogan and he can't replace Hogan. 2 years later, Hogan's out. I mean, like, welcome to the brain of Vince McMahon.
Right.
I mean, that's a dangerous,
scary place.
It is definitely a scary place to be. This is the Pipe Bomb Wrestling Podcast, the show that is for the fans, by the fans. This is your old school Monday edition where we're talking about the thoughts that you have, what you think of when you hear SummerSlam. It is SummerSlam season, so we're going old school. We're talking about all of the great athletes, moments, and matches that made SummerSlam the must-see show of the summer. I'm your phenomenal host, Chris Belcher. You can follow me on social media at Chris Belcher24. The show is at PBW Podcast. You can find us every Monday and every Thursday here on SportsWire, formerly known as Sportinarium Radio. You can also find us on our own YouTube channel if you want the video version of the show, or if you want to listen to us on demand whenever you want. It is available wherever you find your podcast. My tag team partner for this episode is Mr. Old School himself. The Gun Show has arrived. Buy those tickets, folks. The whole podcasting show, Mr. Jared Justice. And Jared, we've talked a lot about some old school guys here in the first part of this episode, but SummerSlam would not be what it is today without a lot of new school guys. So I do want to bring a couple of those guys up who have made a tremendous impact on SummerSlam as well. The first one that I want to bring up is Brock Lesnar. If you go through Brock Lesnar's track record, he debuted in like May of 2002, and he won his first world title against The Rock at SummerSlam 2002. Just 3 months into the business, he was already taking the business by storm. He had a classic match against John Cena where he threw him around and basically squashed him. A tremendous match against CM Punk. Don't forget about The Undertaker. And in most recent years, Roman Reigns and Seth Rollins. I mean, if Bret Hart is an old school SummerSlam guy, you got to think Brock Lesnar is above most of the new school guys when you think of SummerSlam.
Yeah, and I just went back and watched him and Punk just the other day. One of the best SummerSlam matches ever, in my opinion.
For
and
sure.
like you said, Rock and Brock, I remember everybody talking about that back in the day. And that was kind of Rock's out to the business, was it not, for a while?
It was, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was his last world title reign. No, take that back. Last world title reign until he beat Punk, and whenever he dropped the title to Cena, whatever WrestleMania that was, 29 maybe, something like that.
Yeah, I don't know. But yeah, Rock and Brock were you could almost kind of look at those guys as Hogan and Warrior of the new age. So,
yeah.
And then they had their big clash, or at least their most memorable one, I guess their first one, the first big one at SummerSlam.
Yep. Yeah, that's true. I mean, so Brock Lesnar is dominant of something. I didn't even mention the 2016 match against Randy Orton where Brock busted him open. The ref had to stop the match. There's the infamous Chris Jericho fight in the back where Jericho loses his mind on Brock and all those kind of things. But Brock Lesnar, man, has been dominant at SummerSlam over the years. Another guy that's really dominant at SummerSlam. Well, let me throw it to you. If you're looking at new school guys, let's say 2002 on, who do you think of when you think of SummerSlam from about Ruthless Aggression era on?
Oh, man. I mean, probably would have to be Brock. I mean, it's probably going to be the same answer that you just gave. I can't think of any other ones that just over and over again kind of had big matches at SummerSlam. Angle, maybe?
Kurt Angle had Kurt Angle had he was in that triple threat match against Triple H and The Rock in 2001, which was one of the better matches in SummerSlam history. I think he opened the show one year against Rey Mysterio. I think that was 2002.
Triple H, maybe?
Triple H?
You had Triple H and The Rock in the ladder match. You had Triple H and Foley with the special referee of Jesse Ventura.
Yep. Triple H and Shawn.
Triple H and Shawn, like you talked about.
Yep.
Yeah.
Here's one to throw out at you. One of our favorites. What about Edge?
Yeah, Edge had some big moments. Taker has even had some big moments.
Taker's had some big stuff. Edge and Taker, 2008, Hell in a Cell main event of that SummerSlam.
That was good.
One of my favorite matches of all time. Edge, you got to think, had the 2006 TLC match against John Cena. Incredible stuff. That was in Boston, and he got booed out of the building, and he won the match, and that's where he punched Cena's dad and all this other stuff. But then the first ever TLC match happened at a SummerSlam. Dudley's, Hardy's, Edge and Christian. So Edge making a name for himself at SummerSlam. A couple other guys, we mentioned John Cena earlier. John Cena is actually tied. You mentioned Triple H. John Cena and Triple H are tied for the second most matches in SummerSlam history at 14. So Cena's done his damage. Great matches against AJ Styles. I think about the 2015 match against Seth Rollins when it was title for title. Just a fantastic match. And Seth Rollins is another one, man.
Yeah.
Just so many good talents that have really revolutionized SummerSlam and taken that early old school method and what we're used to of SummerSlam and maybe taking it to another level, man. And like I said earlier, made SummerSlam a must-see show.
Yep. Yeah, definitely, man. I mean, there's so many people, so many SummerSlams, this kind of, some of these big SummerSlam matches happened while I was kind of during my hiatus, as Bruce would say, during my hiatus from wrestling. But all these guys, man, just crazy. Yeah, and Super Cena. I mean, look at.
Yeah.
I mean, all the guys we just went over. It seems like they just kept having more and more SummerSlam moments.
Yep.
So, I mean, just some great shows, man.
Yep. Let's talk about a couple of matches real quick from SummerSlam as we kind of get ready to wind this down. I think we're going to wind it down. Again, I mean, we don't have a forum here. We're just kind of chatting, so we could go 20 more minutes. I don't know. But some matches that maybe didn't hit. We talked about all the hits, talked about all the guys who have overperformed and stuff like that. But let's talk about some matches that didn't hit. The first one that comes to mind that just didn't hit is Dusty Rhodes versus the Macho Man Randy Savage from SummerSlam 1990.
You don't think it hit?
I mean, that was really Dusty's last foray in WWF. He went back to WCW after that, and it's just not talked about. You know what I mean? Because you talk about dream matches, that's a dream match right there. Savage and Dusty, two of the most charismatic, over-the-top characters in the history of wrestling. Nobody talks about that they had a feud in 1990.
That is true, but you had Dusty and his polka dots. You didn't have the
Not a rib
dream.
Not a rib pal.
You had a fat guy with a birthmark and polka dots. That kind of seemed and acted somewhat like Dusty Rhodes. So if it didn't hit, I think that's why. Right.
You mentioned a couple others while we were prepping for this show, just talking about some strange matches. Maybe not that they didn't hit, but just strange matches that we kind of look back on and we're like, okay. Well, some of those strange matches, talk about some of those and kind of what sticks out in your mind. Maybe not necessarily negative of SummerSlam, but not necessarily all the way positive.
You just had some unusual matches. I think the hog pen match was at an In Your House, right? It was,
yes.
For some reason, my mind wants to link that to SummerSlam somehow. But you did have the triangle of horror or death or whatever, Mustafa and Adnan and Slaughter against Hogan and Warrior, and it was basically like a huge squash match. I mean, just ridiculous. But
it was,
then you had, like we talked about, it wasn't even a match, and we never even got the full potential of the match. But Savage and Jake kind of started, and you had this whole match made in heaven, and you had the Cobra come out, and the Cobra, of course, did not actually have venom, but it was like legitimately could bite.
Yeah.
And, I mean, just craziness. I don't know. I mean, just that we had some wild matches at SummerSlam.
We did.
Some crazy things.
One of the things that comes to mind for me, and not necessarily wild or crazy, but maybe just didn't go like it was planned, is Lex Luger. 1993 was the departure of Hulk Hogan, and that was supposed to be Lex Luger, the American hero, made in the USA. It was his time to be the next guy. And he has the match with Yokozuna at SummerSlam, and he wins by count out, and he never wins the title.
And they acted like it was this great thing, like he had just defeated Yokozuna. He won by count out.
He won by count out. He did not win the title. So talk about, I mean, obviously there's talk about Lex and not being the most, I don't want to say the most safe worker, but not the most skilled worker. His promo was a little subpar, and maybe he just didn't quite hit with the fans as Vince may have wanted. Are those the reasons that you think of as to why they did not run with him as champion? Or what's your opinion on Lex never getting the title, at least for a short while?
His wrestling was awful. I mean, he just could not do very many wrestling moves, and he couldn't make most of them that he did do look right. And neither could Hogan, but Hogan had the whole, this aura of Hulkamania and WrestleMania. And, he was built in the WWF. Well, Lex was not built in the WWF. He was built in the NWA and WCW. Right. So right there, that's a big, big X whenever we're looking at what Vince wants with people.
Right.
I mean, you couldn't get his look down, I don't think. I mean, you had the narcissist look. You slightly changed it and put some red, white, and blue on him, called him the next big American thing, but he never did anything big for America.
Right.
Hogan beat Slaughter. Hogan, every time there was a bad guy or this big monster, Hogan slayed the dragon. Luger hadn't done any of this stuff.
Right.
He just kind of had a good look and a good body like Hogan and like Warrior, and we changed his outfit, threw some red, white, and blue on him, and shoved him out there.
I would argue, though, that as far as in-ring ability, I would put him over Hogan and Warrior. Wouldn't you?
I think him and Hogan were pretty close. Warrior's about the worst.
Well, yeah.
So, I don't know.
I think I'd put Luger over Hogan as far as in-ring ability goes.
It might depend on their opponent. You put Luger in there against Flair, it's a pretty good match.
Right. You
put Luger in there against somebody else, not so much.
Right. Well, I guess that's true. Let's talk about one more thing from that time period. We talked about The Undertaker earlier, how he'd had some big moments. One that we did not mention was 1994. The Undertaker versus the fake Undertaker. Now, some would say that match wasn't as good as it should have been, mainly because they didn't get the time they were supposed to get. Apparently, there was a lot of time cut from that match because Bret and Owen went long. Go figure. But you had primetime Brian Lee, somebody that you and I are very familiar with from Smoky Mountain Wrestling, playing the part of the Underfaker, managed by the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase. You were watching the WWF at this time, maybe not as closely as you did around 95, 96, but you were certainly, I think, more in tune to the WWF than I was around this time. What were your thoughts on seeing this fake Undertaker going up against the real Undertaker, and then the result that we ended up getting as the main event of SummerSlam 94?
I mean, I had high hopes. I mean, it was very confusing. I was trying to figure out, like, is the Undertaker the real Undertaker playing both of the roles, or is he just playing one role? And here they brought in somebody else to look like him. And as the storyline progressed, if you paid close attention, you could tell, whenever they would get like an accidental good shot of primetime Brian Lee's face as the Undertaker, you could tell that it was not the Undertaker.
Right.
Confusing, right? But I mean, at first it had my interest, and if it had been a good match, I think people would have looked back on it much more fondly, but it was not a good match. So,
right. And I think, like you said, it was a great idea in theory, and the execution of the storyline up until SummerSlam worked out. It was a great story. It had everybody invested, like you just said. But then SummerSlam has to roll around and that dang bell has to ring. And when that bell rang and you got those two face to face, it was like, okay, yes, we know that this guy was not the Undertaker, but now that we're looking at them face to face, like there's not even a comparison. You know what I mean? Like it's not going to be good.
Yep.
You know what I mean?
And it wasn't.
And that's okay. It was 1994. Most everything was not good. But, it was a good storyline. All right, man, let's get ready to put a bow on this conversation about SummerSlam. I began this episode by asking you, when I say SummerSlam, what do you think of? And you said Shawn Michaels and Razor Ramon. That's the first thing you think of. But we established earlier that Bret Hart is probably one of the more synonymous guys with the SummerSlam event. If you had to, I know you said Shawn and Razor. Would you say that Shawn and Razor is the best SummerSlam match of all time? Or do you have another one in mind that you might throw out there?
I mean, like you talked about, I think it was the Heart, Mind, and Soul Undertaker against Bret.
Yeah.
And then Shawn was the special guest ref. Am I correct there?
Yes. Yep. That happened.
And so, I mean, I think that was huge. So yeah, I mean, it would probably be one of those two, or you could have Bret versus Owen in the cage.
Yep.
Classic match. It's never going to be beat. So,
and I think you can also make the argument, again, I'm biased, but Shawn and Triple H from 02 I know you love that match too. So we would rank that one right up there. So when we say SummerSlam, if there's one guy that would be SummerSlam defined, would it be Bret Hart? Or as we've gone on this conversation, has it changed your mind? Would it be a Brock Lesnar or an Ultimate Warrior or a Hulk Hogan or a John Cena even? Or would it be Bret, be synonymous with SummerSlam?
Bret.
Yep. I agree. It seems like the more highlights from Bret Hart's career has come from SummerSlam than even WrestleMania. I mean, he had some great WrestleMania matches. Stone Cold, Shawn, Piper, Owen, but I think SummerSlam outweighs it for sure.
Oh yeah.
Especially, it might not be my favorite and it might not be your favorite, but it's hard to stack anything up to that 92 match at Wembley against British Bulldog.
Very true.
Yep. All right, man. Let's put a bow on this. Anything else you want to add about SummerSlam? Like I said,
I'm pumped to go to it, man. That's the only thing I want to add. It's coming. It's coming on fast.
Less than 2 weeks away, you and I will hopefully, Lord willing, be inside of Allegiant Stadium for SummerSlam 2021. But before we sign off, again, make sure you follow us on social media at PBW Podcast. You can follow me at Chris Belcher24. You can follow Jared at JWJust01. I'll get it out in a minute. If you are listening on Sports Wire, make sure you continue to do that. Make sure you follow them all over social media to keep up with the new announcements, rebranding. You can still check them out at sportinariumradio.com. I'll flash that up on the screen. That way you can check that out. You can listen there for right now, but stay tuned for bigger announcements from them. Make sure you head on over to prowrestlingtees.com/PBW podcast. Buy yourself one of our fancy t-shirts. We would greatly appreciate it. And make sure, again, you follow us on social media, subscribe to us on YouTube, give us a follow on Twitch and on all of those other platforms. Subscribe, download, rate, review, all those things. Interact with us on social media, guys. We love it very much, and we appreciate your support. All right. As we put a bow on the show, ladies and gentlemen, this has been your old school edition of the Buy Bomb Wrestling Podcast. For my brother from another mother, Mr. Jared Justice, giving the old Larry Sabisco wave. I am your host, Chris Belcher, signing off. This has been the Pie Bomb Wrestling Podcast. We will catch you guys down the road.